Now we will start creating the business logic of the microservice. And we will do so by creating the StartGame endpoint. We will create a data type that contains all the entry parameters for the endpoint that, if we remember correctly, was player name and topic. Lastly, we will create the endpoint through a function and the associated business logic. Now let's get hands-on and start creating our first data type that will contain the entry parameters for the endpoint function. To do this, we go to the API folder and by right-clicking, selecting New, and then Type, we can create the new one with the name StartGame params. To start modeling our data type, we will right-click on the Any root and we will see a list of all the availables to select. We can even see the ones already defined by us. In this case, we will be using the generic type OBJ, and we can then right-click on the OBJ tag to reset it back to the Any type, or we can start adding attributes. So we then click on the Add Attribute and we name this new attribute Player Name. Again, we will change the default undefined Any type of the new attribute to this string type. So let's right-click and select String. Now to create the topic that the player will select, we are going to do so the same way we just did with player name. Here, the chosen topic will be represented by the topic identifier, which we will call topic ID. So right-click, add attribute and name it topic ID, and then we select the integer type for this attribute. Now it's time to build the function that will answer the StartGame endpoint. To do this, we will go to the API folder, right-click, and then New. We select Function, and we give it the name StartGame. As we said before, the function will receive a parameter, so we click on the plus sign on the header, and we are going to use the data type we just created, StartGame params. So we look it up and we select it. The name of the parameter in the function will be params. The value the function will return will be the game identifier, so we will select integer data type for the return value. Now we will attend to the right side of the function definition, the routing section. In here, we will define the endpoint routing options. So by clicking on Configure, we can see the window with all the routing information to expose. In Path, we will write the endpoint that the microservice will expose to the outside. We will be using /StartGame. The method is the HTTP verb, which in this case will be post. We write a descriptive remark text. In this case, it's going to be start a new game with the player name and chosen topic. Lastly, we will configure the parameters that the endpoint receives, where they are to be extracted and how they bind to the function parameters. So we click on the plus add, and in this case we want our parameters to be passed through the body from the HTTP petition. So we write body in the name field, body in the in field. This is the place where we tell our function where it should look for the parameter. That's body, query string, or path. And finally, params in the bind field. which is the name we have given the parameter in our function. Finally, a quick remarks field, StartGame input params, player name and topic ID. There are more options related with security and endpoint responses, but for these examples, we are going to leave it blank. These options can be expanded upon the Blazedpath documentation. In this simple manner, we have defined how the parameters are received from the HTTP request and how they translate to parameters in the function. The developer does not need to worry about anything else. Blazedpath handles all the magic behind the REST calls. We click on the OK button and we are ready to develop the logics function. Let's remember that this function will create a register in the game table with the player name, the selected topic ID, initializing the date and time of the game with the current time. Let's now create a variable of type game and call it new game. Let's remember that the data type for this variable was automatically generated through the wizard from the create CRUD API from relational database step. We will initialize the variable with an empty object. We start the player name. And do the same with the topic ID. Now for the starting time, we use a function that already exists in Blazedpath called now. This function returns the current date and time. If we click on the Learn More link, we can access the documentation page where we can find more information on this function. We also assign the new game with a starting score of 0. Next, we need to create the game on the database. And to do this, we will use a function called createGame that we automatically created through the same wizard of the game type that we previously mentioned. Since the createGame function returns a game identifier integer, and since this is the exact same value for the StartGame function, we will use the return blocky directly. By default, each time a microservice starts, it uses a random port. But to do quick tests, we will be using a specific one. So we go to the environment configuration and we specify the 8888 port. Now we start the solution by clicking Run. And to test the microservice, as we previously saw, we can use a Swagger or an existing market tool such as Postman. We chose to use Visual Studio Code with an extension called REST Client. The first test is to obtain topic lists. By clicking on the Send Request, we will send a petition to the microservice, and in the right section, we can see the response the microservice is sending back. Now to start a game, we will send all the parameters. Player name, we will use John Doe. And the topic ID, we will use one of the IDs we got back. When we execute the petition, we can see a return value of the created game. That's a value of 1. Now let's change the topic identifier to a 4 and we send the new petition. And we can see that we now got a 2 as the game identifier. Now to query a list of games that we just created, we click on the send request and we can see the game list with the 2 games we just created. We can query for registers inserted into the database by clicking on the Blazedpath server menu and clicking on our database. We can see that if we right-click on the game table, we can query for the last 10 registers, and we can see the 2 entries inserted through the microservice.